On January 10, 1996, in the quiet halls of Nanjing University, 19-year-old Diao Aiking walked out of her dormitory for the last time. A minor dispute with the dormitory administration over rules had set her on a path that would soon end in unimaginable tragedy. Diao, with her short, boyish haircut and a bright red coat, was never seen again. But for several days, no one seemed to notice. Her family, living far away, was unaware of her disappearance, as communication between them was sparse. She had no reason to think that this mundane evening would be the last time she would step out into the world. The university, a place of learning and growth, would soon be forever stained by the horror that unfolded. Her disappearance, while unnoticed at first, would later become one of the most brutal and unsolved cases in modern Chinese criminal history. For days, no one raised an alarm. Her family, unaware of the brewing danger, assumed she was simply busy with her studies. But as time went on, questions began to surface. Where was she? Why had she not returned to her dorm? Was it an innocent delay, or something far more sinister? Her family eventually realized something was wrong, but by then, it was already too late. Diao Aiking had vanished, and no one seemed to have any idea where she had gone. The university, the last place she was seen, could only offer empty assurances, and the police were left with few leads. The chilling truth was slowly beginning to unfold. Her disappearance was not immediately linked to anything sinister. A young woman walking away from her dorm, a minor argument, and a sudden silence. But as time passed, the search began to reveal a far more disturbing reality. Diao had not simply disappeared, she had been taken. And what awaited her was a fate too horrific to imagine. Days turned into weeks, and still, no sign of Diao Aiking. The campus remained eerily quiet, as if the truth itself was hidden, buried somewhere within the labyrinth of university buildings and shadows. But as police began their investigation, it became clear that this was no simple case of a runaway student. Something far more horrific had happened. The investigation was still in its infancy when the first piece of evidence appeared. It wasn't a clue, it was a discovery that would lead to unimaginable horrors. Someone, or something, had taken Diao, and now the question became, who could commit such a gruesome act in the heart of a university campus? The disappearance of Diao Aiking became a public mystery. Her face, along with the desperate pleas from her family, appeared on posters across the city. But as the police investigated, the gruesome truth about what had happened to her was about to surface, a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. With every passing day, the case seemed to grow colder. The university, a place of learning, had now become a breeding ground for fear and suspicion. Who could have done this? Who was capable of such a brutal act in a place meant to nurture young minds? By the end of January, a dreadful discovery was made. What had initially seemed like a random disappearance was now unfolding as something much more horrific. The question now was clear: how far had the killer gone to hide the evidence? And who was next in line to fall victim to this deadly predator? On January 19, 1996, 9 days after Diao Aiking disappeared, the unthinkable happened. A street cleaner in Nanjing discovered a large plastic bag on the side of a street near the university. Initially, he thought it contained discarded meat. But the truth that lay inside was far more horrific than anyone could imagine. As the bag was opened, the contents revealed human flesh, dismembered and carefully packed into pieces. It was as if someone had taken the time to methodically dissect a body, cutting it into over 2,000 pieces. The horror of it wasn't just in the violence, but in the cold, calculated nature of the dismemberment. Over the following days, more parts of Diao Aiking's dismembered body were discovered in different areas surrounding the university. Each piece was found with alarming precision. Her body had been sliced, boiled, and mutilated in a way that suggested a horrifying level of premeditation. Every part of the body was carefully arranged, meticulously dismembered, and there were no signs of panic. The brutality of the act suggested someone who had not acted on impulse, but on a cold, deliberate plan. Diao Aiking's death was not a crime of passion, it was an execution, executed with precision and control. This was not the work of someone overcome by rage or blind hatred. This was the act of a person who knew exactly what they were doing. The lack of emotion, the lack of a frenzy in the dismemberment, suggested a killer who was thinking clearly, perhaps even enjoying the control they held over their victim. Psychologically, the dismemberment served two purposes for the killer. It was an expression of control and a way to erase any trace of the victim. To the killer, Diao Aiking was no longer a person, she was just another object to be discarded. Her life, her identity, had been completely obliterated. Each body part, each piece that was found, was more than just evidence. It was a testament to the cold, calculated mind of the killer. The brutality wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Guo Longhai, the killer, had gone beyond the realm of murder into a twisted form of psychological dominance. He wasn't just killing, he was leaving behind a psychological imprint that would haunt anyone who came into contact with the case. Guo's actions were not only cruel, but they were also deeply personal. The dismemberment of the body, the removal of organs, was a symbolic act. It was an expression of his need to control, to take power not only over the victim's body but over her very existence. This was about domination, not just death. Psychologists who studied this case believed that Guo had become so detached from any normal sense of empathy that he saw his victims as mere objects. The dismemberment was not just to destroy the evidence, it was to destroy the person, to erase their humanity completely. Perhaps the most terrifying realization was that Guo was operating on a different level entirely. He didn't kill because he was angry. He didn't kill because of a fleeting moment of rage. He killed because he wanted to, because he could. And that, more than anything else, makes him the most dangerous kind of killer. As the body parts were found scattered around a university campus, the investigation took a dark turn. The police were faced with a chilling reality: this was not a simple murder, but something far more sinister. The brutality of the dismemberment, the lack of clear evidence, and the seeming randomness of the locations where the parts were discovered all pointed to a calculated killer. Over 2,000 pieces of evidence were collected, each one as disturbing as the next. Forensic experts combed through the fragments, attempting to piece together what had happened to Diao Aiking. But the methodical dismemberment left no obvious traces of the killer's identity. The crime scene offered little to go on, leaving investigators grasping at thin air. The victim's internal organs had been boiled, a gruesome detail that left investigators stunned. Not only did this act demonstrate the killer's deep psychological detachment, but it also revealed his advanced knowledge of anatomy, or at least access to tools and information that would allow him to carry out such precise actions. Why would someone go to such lengths to destroy the body? What kind of person could be so meticulous, so cold, that they would take the time to remove organs, boil them, and dismember a body? The police were now dealing with a killer who was not only brutal but also highly calculated in his approach. From the moment the body was discovered, the investigation became a race against time. The police had no leads, no witnesses, and only a dismembered body to work with. But they were determined. As the investigation continued, they began to connect the dots between the crime scene and the suspect. With every piece of evidence gathered, the police began to piece together a picture of the killer's mind. The precision of the dismemberment suggested a methodical individual, someone who took the time to plan out every detail. This was not a spur-of-the-moment crime, it was a carefully orchestrated act, executed with chilling intent. The police began to explore the possibility that the killer had knowledge of anatomy. Could it be a medical student, a professional, or someone with access to anatomical knowledge? The question lingered, and as they started to gather witness statements, one name began to emerge as a potential suspect. Despite the mounting evidence, the police still had no concrete suspect. Every lead seemed to dead end. Guo Longhai, a seemingly ordinary man, blended seamlessly into the background. He had no criminal record, no obvious red flags. His persona as a writer of crime novels had everyone fooled. But there was one key piece of evidence that would soon come to light. As the investigation stalled, the police focused on forensic evidence, the DNA left behind at the crime scene. They compared it to known profiles in their databases, hoping for a match. But each test brought them closer to the truth, yet still, they were no closer to catching the killer. As the investigation dragged on, one chilling thought crossed the minds of the investigators: what kind of person could do this? What psychological profile matched such calculated brutality? The answer to that question was closer than they realized. With the body parts scattered, the police were faced with a troubling question: who could commit such a horrific act? As the investigation unfolded, investigators began to look at the people who could have had the knowledge and motive to carry out the dismemberment. The list of suspects quickly grew, but each lead seemed to lead to a dead end. Initial leads pointed toward individuals with a background in anatomy or medical knowledge. The precision of the dismemberment suggested that whoever carried out the crime had experience with the human body. But there was no obvious suspect, no one in the area had been flagged with a criminal history that would tie them to the crime. The investigators considered a number of profiles. One possible suspect was an individual in his 30s, with a history of being physically fit and knowledgeable about anatomy. Another theory suggested the involvement of someone with a connection to the university, possibly a fellow student, staff member, or even a professor who might have had access to the victim. The police questioned several students and faculty members from the university, but none seemed to stand out as obvious suspects. They dug deeper, looking for any link between the victim and the people on campus, but nothing concrete came to light. It was as though the killer was just another face in the crowd, blending in seamlessly with the community. As the investigation continued, one theory began to take hold. The killer might be someone with a deep understanding of human behavior and psychology. A person who knew how to manipulate their environment, to charm their victims into trusting them before turning on them with brutal violence. Guo Longhai, a crime novelist, became a suspect in the investigation, though his name wasn't initially on the list. His writing, which was filled with detailed accounts of murder, echoed the very crimes that were being investigated. Was it possible that the killer had been inspired by his own stories? Was it a case of fiction turning into deadly reality? Despite the lack of concrete evidence linking Guo to the crime, His eerie proximity to the case, his books, his knowledge of anatomy, and his chilling ability to write about death with such precision led the police to question whether he had been involved. Could a writer with such a deep understanding of crime have turned his writing into real-life murder? The investigation reached a critical point when forensic evidence began to suggest that the killer had been careful, methodical, and highly knowledgeable. The precision in the dismemberment, the lack of a struggle, and the deliberate placement of body parts all pointed to someone who understood the human body and how to manipulate it. As the pieces of the investigation came together, the police began to focus on a small group of suspects who had access to the victim and knowledge of dismemberment. But with every suspect, there seemed to be just one more layer of complexity. Was the killer someone they had overlooked? Or was the answer hiding right in front of them? With the investigation still stalled, the question remained, how could a person blend so seamlessly into society, leaving no trace of their true identity behind? And, more chillingly, how many more lives had the killer stolen before Diao Iking's tragic end? The hunt for the killer continued, but the answers seemed just beyond reach. After months of dead ends, the investigation took a surprising turn in 2001. A breakthrough finally came when a surviving victim came forward with crucial information. This woman had narrowly escaped the killer's grasp and was able to recall important details that would prove vital to solving the case. The survivor described how the killer, who had introduced himself as friendly and trustworthy, invited her to his home after a brief conversation. He was calm and charming, gaining her trust easily. However, once she was inside, things quickly escalated. She was attacked, but in a desperate act of survival, she managed to escape. The police now had a name to work with: Guo Longhai, a man who lived in the same neighborhood and had even visited local hospitals. But his name had not appeared on any prior suspect lists. He was a man whose outward appearance seemed ordinary, which made him nearly impossible to identify. With this new lead, the police moved swiftly. Guo had been living nearby, a quiet man with no significant criminal history. He blended into the community, working in a small, local business. The more they dug into his life, the more his connection to the crime seemed undeniable. But Guo was clever, and he wasn't about to make it easy for them. After weeks of surveillance, the police finally took their chance. Guo Longhai was apprehended while walking on the streets of Nanjing, caught by the authorities before he could escape. The arrest was swift, but it was filled with an eerie calm. Guo showed no sign of panic, almost as if he had been expecting it. The moment of his arrest was chilling. Guo, who had spent years slipping through the cracks, was now caught in the web of justice. The police finally had their man. But as they dug deeper into his life, they were stunned to discover the twisted motivations that had driven him to commit such horrific crimes. Guo's confession was chilling in its simplicity. He admitted to the murders, explaining how he would lure his victims with charm, only to turn on them when they were most vulnerable. What shocked the authorities even more was the calmness with which he described his actions, as though they were nothing more than a routine. Guo's motives were unsettlingly cold. He saw his victims not as people, but as characters in a twisted narrative that he controlled. To him, their lives were simply tools to assert his dominance, a way to experience power and control over those he deemed weak. The brutality of the dismemberment was just a way to erase their existence entirely. The police had finally solved the case, but the psychological horror of Guo's actions would haunt them for years to come. He was not a man driven by momentary rage. No, Guo was a predator, one who took pleasure in the suffering of others, and who could kill without hesitation, without remorse. Guo's arrest was the end of one chapter, but for the families of his victims, the scars remained. His ability to blend in, to deceive and manipulate, left a lasting impression. But the case raised an unsettling question: how many more like Guo are there, hiding behind facades, living amongst us, waiting for the right moment to strike? As Guo Longhai's trial began in 2002, the entire nation watched in stunned silence. A man who had once been regarded as a respected crime writer was now facing charges of murder and dismemberment. The courtroom, filled with spectators and journalists, was charged with a sense of disbelief. How could someone so ordinary, so seemingly unremarkable, commit such horrific acts? Throughout the trial, Guo maintained his cold and detached demeanor. As the prosecutor outlined the brutal details of his crimes, Guo sat motionless, offering no sign of remorse. His eyes remained fixed ahead, and his body language spoke volumes. He was unmoved by the emotional testimonies of the victims' families. Guo's lack of remorse was chilling. He admitted to his crimes with a sense of matter-of-factness, describing the murders in the same way one might recount a chapter in a book. To him, the murders were not the result of anger or passion. No, they were simply a part of his narrative, his twisted tale of power and control. Guo's defense team argued that he had been mentally unstable, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. His confessions were detailed and chilling, and forensic evidence linked him directly to the murders. Despite the defense's claims, the prosecution emphasized that Guo had acted with clear intent and precision, without any signs of mental instability. The courtroom became the stage for a battle of minds. The prosecutor painted a portrait of Guo as a cold, calculating killer, while the defense tried to convince the court that he was driven by something beyond his control. But no matter how the arguments played out, the question remained: was Guo simply a product of his own twisted mind, or was there something more? The turning point in the trial came when the prosecution presented Guo's writings, his crime novels. The similarities between the gruesome murders and the stories he had written were undeniable. It was as if Guo had been living out the very plots he had created, turning fiction into reality. Guo's writing was not just the product of his imagination, it was a blueprint for his crimes. The prosecutor argued that Guo had used his novels as a way to manifest his darkest fantasies, turning them into real-life horror. His knowledge of crime, gained through years of writing, allowed him to plan and execute the murders with chilling precision. Guo's confession in the courtroom was both unsettling and revealing. He spoke with cold detachment, as if narrating a story he had long ago written. His lack of remorse, his inability to empathize with the families of his victims, painted a chilling picture of a man completely disconnected from humanity. Despite the overwhelming evidence and his own confession, the trial was a complicated process. The question of whether Guo's actions were the result of his psychological state or his calculated desire for control hung over the proceedings like a dark cloud. In the end, the court had to decide if he was a criminal mastermind or simply a man consumed by his own mind. In the end, Guo was sentenced to death for his crimes. But the trial left behind a lingering question: was he simply a man who had allowed his dark fantasies to consume him, or was he something far more sinister? The courtroom had offered no easy answers, and as the case came to a close, the public was left to ponder the true nature of Guo Longhai. As the dust settled from Guo Longhai's trial, his story left a profound impact on those who followed it. A celebrated crime writer turned brutal killer, a man who had written about death and destruction, only to embody it in the most horrifying way possible. Guo's case raised disturbing questions. How much can fiction influence reality? How far can a twisted mind go when it has the knowledge and the power to manifest its darkest desires? Guo's brutal actions were not just the result of a fractured mind or a violent fantasy, they were a testament to the dangers of unchecked obsession. His novels, once celebrated for their gritty realism, became blueprints for his crimes. The disturbing truth is that a man who spent years creating stories of horror could, in the end, live out those stories in the most chilling way possible. Psychologically, Guo's case was a rare glimpse into the mind of a killer who had the ability to compartmentalize his actions. He didn't see himself as the monster, he was simply following the script he had written. His novels were not just stories, they were his manifesto. And in his mind, every act of violence, every dismembered body, was part of a grand narrative only he could control. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Guo's case was his complete lack of remorse. In court, he displayed no guilt, no sign of regret for the lives he had taken. To him, it was just another chapter in his own dark story. And for those who witnessed his trial, it was a haunting reminder of the dangers of detachment and the cold indifference that can grow in a person when they become numb to the humanity of others. Guo's story doesn't end with his conviction. It leaves behind questions about the nature of evil and the human capacity for cruelty. How many more like him are out there, hiding in plain sight, living among us while secretly harboring dark, violent fantasies? Guo didn't act out of some sudden impulse, he planned, he crafted, and he executed. This was a mind that knew exactly what it was doing, and yet, it was still capable of chilling indifference toward the suffering he caused. His story serves as a warning to all of us, that sometimes, the people we trust and admire can turn out to be the very ones capable of the most horrific acts. We live in a world where the line between fiction and reality is increasingly blurred, and Guo's case is a chilling reminder of how far someone can go when their fantasies bleed into the real world. While Guo's case is over, its impact is far from gone. It continues to haunt those who followed it, a dark reminder that even the most ordinary person can harbor the most twisted desires. And as we look back on the case, we must ask ourselves, how many more stories like this are hidden in the shadows, waiting to unfold? Thank you for watching. If you found Guo Longhai's case as disturbing as we did, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. Join us as we continue to explore real-life crime stories, uncovering the darkness that exists behind closed doors. Your support helps us shine a light on the stories that matter. Until next time, remember, the darkest stories often remain untold, hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. Stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop asking the tough questions.